flow of capital to keep the economy going, which is why they have the low unemployment rate as well. So this decentralized banking system is an important thing to know. You covered all the different states. What's interesting is that Hawaii actually passed a bill out of their house, but it died in the Senate in Hawaii to establish a task force. And Marcus Oshiro was the chair of the Finance Committee over there, which is their Ways and Means. I participated in this thing called Progressive States Network. And so at one of our meetings last year, I was telling him about this. He said, wow, that's a great idea. So he put a bill together in Hawaii. They got it through the House, but they didn't get it through the Senate. California passed one through the entire, did you cover that? Okay. Well, if you'll go to Public Banking Institute's website at publicbankinginstitute.org, they've been documenting what's been going on with California recently pretty well. And they passed it through their entire assembly and legislature. The governor ended up not signing the bill. He didn't veto it, but he just didn't sign it and returned it back to the legislature. And the message was that it was a good thing that he didn't veto it or sign it. He had campaigned on, which I still think is a weak excuse, but he said he campaigned absolutely no new task forces. So he returned it back to the legislature without vetoing it, but the implication is that they should just go ahead and start the task force anyway. So interestingly, their bill was titled the California Investment Trust. It was kind of following the lines of our Washington Investment Trust. There's an interesting story there too. The speaker, Speaker Frank Chop, who totally supports this whole concept, said, you got to get a different name for this thing. You know, people hate the state and they hate banks, and when you put the two together, they're really going to hate this. So come up with a better name. So that's why we came up with the Washington Investment Trust. But it's just a name. What we're really doing is creating the State Bank of Washington, which unfortunately that name has already been copyrighted too. So yeah, there's a building in Port Townsend that says Bank of Washington. So you can see there's a lot of activity. President Obama had a national infrastructure bank proposed in his recent jobs bill. So I'm not sure how that was going to be initially capitalized. I think we were saying that was going to be privately capitalized, or somebody was saying that last night. Treasury was going to fund it, was my impression, but then I guess they were going to sell bonds, which then translates to private ownership. I'm not really sure. But I did go back to Washington, D.C. to lobby our congressional delegation. A couple of weeks ago, I was back at the Reclaim the American Dream conference, which was fabulous, by the way, in D.C. And while I was there, I lobbied our congressional delegation and was trying to look for some initial capitalization money for our Bank of Washington. We got a very good reception. So the last person that I talked to, I spoke with Senator Cantwell's office, Representative Inslee, McDermott, Smith, Adam Smith. I don't remember who all I talked to, but they are all very interested in helping us find resources to capitalize the bank if we can get them up and running here. Well, you know all the good things that we could do. Well, one of the things, one of the first things that triggered this, me getting involved in, I am no financial institutions expert, but as a person of color in the legislature, people of color who come to the legislature with issues invariably end up in my office, whether they live in my district or not, because they view me as sort of one of only 7 people of color in the legislature who really can empathize with their interests. Well, a few years ago, I had some Mexican fruit farmers from Yakima come to my office, and they were saying literally they were going to lose their farm. Nothing had changed in their credit rating. It's just that the banks had decided to either cut off their line of credit or whatever, you know. And when you're a farmer, you've got to get to harvest, because that's where your money's going to come in. If they cut off your line of credit and you can't get to harvest, you're going to lose your farm. And they're literally in tears. So we thought, well, this whole state bank is on the committee is to represent farming interests on the task force. But the Grange is very interested in the concept. Although their internal processes, they need a bill to look at, and then they poll their membership statewide. But conceptually, they've been very supportive of where we're trying to go with this. So even in the rural communities, there is support for this. This is an interesting ditty that I took out of a white paper that was done for Washington State by the Center for State Innovation. A guy named Sam Munger wrote a whole white paper on what a state bank can do for Washington. And in this example, he actually extrapolated some numbers out to show what type of return we might get on the investment into a state bank. So if you get said per 100 million of initial capitalization, because as Ellen explained, you have to have initial capitalization money before you can have money to lend out. We've got the tax revenues as a base, but you need to have that initial capitalization to be 10% of the supporting base for the loans, outstanding loans. So their analysis is that we would break even by year 3. So we would have to eat the initial investment for a few years. But by year 5, for each 100 million of capitalization, initial capitalization, we turn 5.5 million. By year 10, 39, as you can see, by year 40, $743 million per 100 million of initial capitalization. So we're trying to, the more we put into it, the more work we can do. Can you imagine if we funded it with $1 billion of initial capitalization? I think right now we've actually, the task force has identified maybe $2 billion that we might be able to initially capitalize this, which would mean $20 billion worth of work that we could accomplish with job creation and stimulating our economy, developing our infrastructure. So it's pretty exciting, the potential that this thing has. But personally, for me, it's not so much about how much are we going to initially capitalize it or how much can it do right now. For me, looking at the Bank of North Dakota and admiring the fact that here we are 91 years later and they are thriving. What I want to do is have an institution 50 years, 75, 100 years down the road for our grandchildren, my grandchildren, that we will have amassed sufficient capital over the years that we could really survive a recession like we're going through right now. We could self-fund our own economic development. So it's about the long term for me personally. That being said, we can do an enormous amount of good right now depending on how much we're willing to put into this thing initially. But the criteria is it has to be run like a bank. It cannot be run like an economic development fund, slush fund. It's got to be protected against, it's got to have firewalls against political influence. It's got to follow sound banking principles, so we're not getting greedy and say we're going to hit the mother load right away. We're looking long term, something that's going to be there for our grandchildren. This is the best present we could give them. It's something that they can rely on. You try and develop a college fund for your kids or whatever. Well, we can fund student loans. The Bank of North Dakota student lending was actually their largest program area until the federal government took it over. And the reason it was because the banks just were failing in student lending. So the Bank of North Dakota took that program area over, and it was their very largest department. They've got a whole floor in that beautiful new building, a picture of which you saw, dedicated to student loans. Now the federal government has taken that over. But the Bank of North Dakota has redefined their niche because student loans only pay for tuition and books, and it doesn't barely even cover that anymore. And so there are many other costs associated with going to school, and that's their niche, is that they look at wraparound funding to get the student through school. at a reasonable rate. So anyway, looking at it for the long term. Okay, I don't think there's too much that gets kind of wonky. Oh, this is a great story. I went back to North Dakota last year, did a little road trip, as I like to do every now and then, talked with the president of the Bank of North Dakota. And his takeaway piece of advice to me was that you have to run the bank like a bank. You can't, it has to be run by financial institutions experts. It cannot be run by economic development people, because economic development people have never seen a project they didn't want to fund. And you don't want this bank to go broke. So you got to be very smart about how you do it. But while I was there, it's in Bismarck. I should also say, a lot of people have asked me, hey, when can I put my money in this bank? Well, the Bank of North Dakota, their philosophy is the bank does belong to the people. So if the people want to keep their money there, they certainly should be entitled to it. But they do not market that whatsoever. So I think they have maybe 600 personal accounts there. The bank itself has one branch. It's in Bismarck. If you want to bank with the Bank of North Dakota, you got to drive to Bismarck. They got one teller cage there. You got to walk up to that teller cage. They don't have ATMs, nothing like that. But there are, I got to say, there's a lot of good principled people that still want to bank with the Bank of North Dakota. So more power to them. But that's not their goal. So when I was there at the state capitol in Bismarck, they have the state archives there. And so, you know, Ellen was talking about some of the history on the founding of the Bank of North Dakota, and I was doing some research going through their archives. And what struck me was that back in 1919, when they were running the public campaign to convince voters to accept this, this public ownership concept, they had a problem. They felt like they were out of control of their own lives, that their lives were being run by the banks and the railroads back in Minneapolis, and back in here in Wall Street. And they were being squeezed, and so they passed 3 bills at that time. The Nonpartisan League got elected in, which Democrats and Republicans were both blown out. This new third party won favor, and they had 3 bills. One was to create the Bank of North Dakota. The second one was to create a state-owned granary because the farmers were being squeezed by the corporations. So what's new? And then the third one was to sell bonds to capitalize the Bank of North Dakota. But they had to run a public campaign. So what's interesting was this was what their campaign was built around. They were following the Seattle model. So their newspaper said, what Seattle has done, America's best example of public ownership and successful operations. And back in the day, our farmers were facing the same problems. They were being squeezed off the ports. They're basically usury, I don't know what the right, not usury because it wasn't interest. They were, all of their profits were being taken by being charged such exorbitant rates by the private shipping lines, so they couldn't ship their product. So that's when the Seattle created the Port of Seattle. You may recognize this. This is that big granary down there at Earl Edwards Park on the Seattle waterfront. The caption says, probably the only publicly owned granary in the United States. So back in the day, they were using Seattle as the model to sell public ownership to the people in North Dakota. Here we are a century later now almost, and the whole thing has gone around one big circle, and now they're teaching us how to do it right. So hopefully we'll get there this upcoming legislative session. Be happy to answer any questions later on if you want.
Thanks, Bob, and thank you, Ellen. So we're going to have some opportunity for folks to got a microphone down at either end here, so if you've got a question you'd like for either one of these folks or both of these folks to answer, if you just come on down one of those microphones, you certainly can. Also, if anybody tries to take off or anything like that, or when the event's done, just to remind folks, if you would, please stop by and see the 4 organizations that have tables out front. They've got more information about these issues. And if you can find it possible to do it, we'd sure love some donations to help cover the cost of this event too. So, not to hit you during tough times, but if you can. So, anyway, questions, please come on up if you've got some to the microphone.
The resistance to this idea is going to come from. I can't think the bankers in New York are going to like it much. They just spent, Costco's spending $22 million to get the liquor flowing more freely in this state. I cannot imagine what New York will spend to prevent this. Do you know where the resistance will come from?
It will be 2 places, the banks and the state treasurer. And the state treasurer has opposition to it, and you can go to his website where if you go, he has a blog or something, and he discusses his major objections, but the way that I saw it essentially was, number 1, he claims it's unconstitutional, and number 2, he says the treasurer's already doing a good job of investing our dollars and getting the highest rate of return of any state in the country. I don't think that he's actually compared against North Dakota, where Ellen's figure was what, 19% return. But that is not, that may be a treasurer's view, but it's not a banker's view of what we can do with that money, because you have to weigh in the opportunity costs of how else could we be using that money to leverage it back into our system. So, for instance, last year, the state, off of its investments, we earned $4 million. I mean, that's like nothing. That's like budget dust, really, when it gets down to what good could our tax revenues have done had we invested it back into our own local economies. And you get this multiplier effect, because when you support small businesses or create jobs, those workers then spend their money back in the community, and so on and so on. So you've got this multiplier effect, and that doesn't enter into a financial calculation, at least in the treasurer's company. So just those 2 areas, the banks and, but hopefully we can get the treasurer involved.
She's naive. She thinks the banks are all.
I have a series of questions. The first question is, if we created the Public Bank of Washington, would it still be a member of the FDIC and a depositor to the Federal Reserve banking system?
No.
So it would operate independently, but it would still use Federal Reserve currency or Federal Reserve notes?
It would not be federally a member of the FDIC, because they only insure accounts up to $250,000 anyway, and so, so there's not much point in that.
Okay, so it wouldn't be a member, but we would still be using the Federal Reserve banking notes.
Yeah, we would, and we were talking about this yesterday over dinner. Former Seattle Treasurer Lloyd Hara, who is now the King County Auditor, when he was the City of Seattle Treasurer, he tried to establish a Bank of Seattle, actually. And he was stonewalled by the Fed in some technical detail about not being able to get a routing number to operate under, which I don't really understand how that happened. But my vision, and I don't want to say that we are or are not going to do anything, because I want the task force to come up with an opinion that everybody supports. And if I start saying this is what we're going to do, then that would preempt them. They'll feel like they didn't hear their voice. So, but what I would like to see is us have an account at the Federal Reserve, so that we can go to them, get these low interest loans at 0.2%. Then we can leverage that back into our communities. So,
okay, I think that would be the problem with the public bank, because I mean, I think she would probably understand this a little bit more, but the Constitution of the United States is not, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution requires Congress actually coin and regulate the value of money. And Article 1, Section 10 states that money has to be coined in gold or silver, and it cannot be paper currency, which is what we currently run off of. Congress doesn't regulate money. It belongs to the Federal Reserve, which is a privately owned organization. So the fiat currency itself is illegal. And Congress has no, I mean, for us to create a public banking system that runs off of fiat currency under the Federal Reserve doesn't solve anything. Because we're still using illegal money that can be fractional, like there's still fractional reserve banking. I mean, we probably wouldn't, in this situation probably wouldn't exist, but we're not solving the fundamental issues that are currently facing the United States or even the state of Washington.
I would probably disagree with you on that, because the Constitution says Congress shall have the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. It does not say who has the power to print paper money, and there are legal decisions going back for 200 years arguing over this point, and some say yes, some say no, but the argument in favor of paper money is that what they meant by that was they don't talk about who has the power to print paper money. So they don't talk about credit cards because they didn't have credit cards. So what they meant was, or even Andrew Jackson said, I don't know who has the power under the Constitution, but I know that if anybody has the power, it's Congress, because they're the only ones that's giving any kind of power. The coin money does coin money mean print stamp coins, like private people can bring their gold to the mint and then the government stamps it, or does coin money, is that a term? If you look in the dictionary, one definition of that is to print money or to create money. So they've been arguing about it for 200 years, so it's not a clear-cut deal.
Well, yeah, I understand what you're saying, but the Congress does not coin its money at all. The Federal Reserve is not a federal government agency. It is a private bank.
Here's what I think. Congress could, and this is what I think they should do. They should coin 14 $1 trillion coins, put it in their bank account with the Fed, pay off the federal debt, and now you would have government-issued money. Rip up the debt, pay it off, take the bonds, and rip them up, get rid of them. So instead of $15 trillion in government bonds floating out there, you have, or 14 trillion, you have 14 trillion in.
So you're not in favor of eliminating the Federal Reserve at all? Would you keep it?
I would nationalize it, yeah. I mean, I think a central bank serves good functions, but it shouldn't be private.
So we would keep the central bank? Okay, I know, I'm trying to understand, this is kind of a big thing. But you would keep the Federal Reserve intact, but you would put it under government control. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, make it actually a government-owned and controlled central bank. I mean, there are other, like Canada owns their central bank, but they don't borrow from it. They borrow from the private banks because of all this pressure, basically from the City of London. So.
Okay, I think that's where we disagree. I would end the Fed is where I think that would end. But all right, thank you.
Okay.
I was just wondering how far having the state of bank would go towards addressing the problems that have created the $1.6 billion hole that we're looking at. Because it seems like just half a year ago we scratched and fought to agree on a budget, and somehow the best experts at Olympia didn't come up with $1.6 billion. And is the stability that a state bank is going to bring that going to stabilize our situation so we can get out of owing money?
That's looking into a crystal ball with a domino effect that who knows. I mean, that's like chaos theory at its finest to say, if we had fixed this, how would it have fixed 1.6 billion? Would a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil? This is not a panacea. This is a long-term, sound business practice and best use of states' taxpayers' dollars. So it can do the work as outlined in that rate of return chart, but that just depends on how much we're willing to commit to initially capitalizing it. It could, if it creates enough jobs to generate that much new revenue that it could cover the debt. I don't know. We're waiting patiently.
Yes, I have a question for Ellen. Ellen, have you heard of the Jacques fresco and the Venus project?
but no, I mean, remind me.
Okay, it just has to do with, I'd say he's not only me, but you could say he's the modern day Leonardo da Vinci. And he says the monetary system is, he advocates doing away with the monetary system and going to a resource-based system. His whole point is that the resources of this planet belong to everybody, not just the few and wealthy. So I encourage everybody within earshot to check out thevenusproject.com. It, I think, is a bold look for way down the road, and the sooner that could be implemented, it would benefit everybody.
How would decisions be made on what kind of projects would get funded? How democratic would the process be? And also, considering climate change and other environmental problems, how can we make sure that we get projects funded that are sustainable environmentally?
Well, I think if we follow the Bank of North Dakota, we don't fund projects. I mean, the government, the politicians do not walk over to the bank and say, we want this project funded. The bank looks at the project and says, if this project is a viable investment, we'll invest in it. But we're here to basically make money for the state. But in other words, we're serving the public interest, but we're doing it as bankers and not as a slush fund for politicians.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that being said, I think that when we're establishing our state institution, we have to be thoughtful about the process of evolving this institution so that it does become what we really want it to be. Initially, though, we just want to get something up and running. And probably the biggest bang for the buck for the initial program area will likely be something like infrastructure development. And the state already has a pretty good process for vetting infrastructure projects based on need and that sort of thing. So there is a huge unmet need of infrastructure projects, and that's where the bank could really kickstart the job creation.
A banker in Oregon who was working on this project in Oregon suggested, he said there is a lot of basically free money that the banks are making. For instance, VA loans, FHA loans, these are like loans guaranteed by the government. So they're like 3% guaranteed money for the bank. So that's the first thing you should do is take this free money that's going to the Wall Street banks. And then you've got that guaranteed profit, say 3% that you get on all these loans. And then you can do the riskier things with those. You know, you can do your green projects or whatever. And if you lose the money, it doesn't matter. You haven't touched the taxpayers' money. So that's one possibility.
Yes, I have a question for Ms. Brown. I don't know if you've heard this one before. It's basically, what is money? And by that I mean not just the attributes of money, like that it's used to facilitate circulation of goods, that it's used to pay debts, that it's used as a hoard, a store, place of wealth. But when you think about it, somebody who has a lot of money has a lot of power in our society. A disproportionate amount of power. And the question becomes, why? What is money? How does this thing, this piece of paper, whether it says $20 like this or whether it says 20 billion, how does this thing acquire so much power that it can command the labor of millions of people, it can command the gathering of unlimited amounts of resources to the person who possesses it? What is the essence of money that gives it that power? That's my question.
I would say that money is, today, it's an instrument of control. It's a tool of control, and that's under our current system. That's what's the problem with the system. And that's why we need to redesign it so that money is, I think what money should be, or really is merely a series of legal agreements. In other words, it's a deal between you and me I say to the community in general, trust me with your goods and services, and I will build something and make a profit for all of us, and I'll pay you back. And that's where money comes from. That's the basic credit model. It's not really barter. Everybody, the economists all say that money evolved from barter, but in fact, David Garber, I think, wrote a book on this, that in fact, no primitive society actually has a barter system. Primitive societies are gifting systems because they are families, you know, it's like an extended family. It's a village where everybody knows each other. So you don't say, 2 of my chickens is worth 4 of your bushels of corn. I mean, nobody figures it out like that, just like you wouldn't do that with your children. It's more like, oh, nice pig, and you say, oh, take my pig. And then you owe the person something else. You know, it's all this sort of implied, everybody doing their duty for the group. So where the numbers actually come in is a legal thing. That when somebody kills your cow, or when somebody kills your brother, suddenly you want your pound of flesh, and you want revenge. So in Hammurabi's code, and this goes back to the Sumerians and Babylonians, that's where the numbers came in. There was a certain price for killing somebody's brother, and it was specified. So I would say all of money is actually a legal agreement, a series of legal agreements, and proper overseer is not a private bank which is lending you pieces of metal that were dug in the ground. Proper overseer is a legal system. In other words, it's a court system. So that's really what the bank should be. It's the middleman between, it's really the people themselves who create money. What they do is they turn their promise to pay the money. And they're going to the bank, they sign a piece of paper like their mortgage, which says, I promise to pay over 30 years X amount of money. And that mortgage is actually a negotiable instrument. That is the money. That's what the bank takes to the investors and says, this is a valuable piece of paper, pay us money for it, and then the investors give the money, and that's where the whole system gets to work. So the middleman is just the overseer of the deal. So ideally that should be a public function, just as a court system is a public system.
That was interesting.
He's way smarter than me, but I just view it
That was
like
really interesting.
money is just an intellectual construct that gives us a basis for negotiating. So, like casinos, they mint chips, right? And that chip is valuable in that casino, but it's not valuable anywhere else. And so you need a different instrument that's more transferable in a larger economy. So I just view money as like big chips. If you want to participate in that economy, you don't have to. You can go out and live in Alaska and an hinterland and not need money at all.
You get $1,100 here, government.
Like, my name is Richard Frank. I was looking at money in terms of like idioms, so I gotta make some money. I have to make some money. So money was a definition, right? Okay, look it up. Look at the words and definitions. Go get a piece of money like $1. You read the thing on the back, it says what it's for. So define that. You guys talk about building a new bank. Like, is it gonna be a segregated bank like Washington State employees or open savings loan?
It's going to be your bank, brother.
Our bank, yeah, that's what I'm telling. So, with the concept of banks and money, I had a hobby, like studying it. So, I looked up the Department of Treasury, U.S. government, FDIC, and I know all those headings, they have everything that's government money for the United States of America. They have the problem, like 14.9 trillion, to me, is an arbitrary factor. Like, you print metal, I print